afternoon. Richard Littlemore. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm more thrilled that you're here. Optimism is not necessarily a driving force in my life these days. The performance of media generally, and the trajectory of climate change, and the other things that are, the midterm elections. Just I can find any number of things to be kind of bitchy about. So seeing all of you here on a Saturday afternoon, when I presume it's not absolutely horrible outside, is inspiring. I'm delighted. I'm going to bump a little bit off what the trajectory of what I was planning to say, because I have to comment a little on some of the stuff that Ken said. I was an editorial writer at the Vancouver Sun during those years that he's talking about, and I'd be here today to tell you that those were the glory days. And anyone reading the Sun today, I would challenge you to disagree. It was a rambunctious and sometimes hilarious time at the Sun. And particularly, one of the things that I want to talk about today formally is spin and greenwash, and the professionalism of the people who are trying to lead us in the wrong direction. And I can tell you, as a member of the media, that it's way more pleasant to be spun by people who are highly professional. The example that I would immediately bring today is that in these days, the guys from Macmillan Bloedel would come in, and they would be impeccably tailored, and they'd be incredibly polite. All these guys with really thin watches and nice suits, and they'd come in and they'd tell us they would tell us how sincerely they cared about jobs, about the things that they've done for the province, about how really carefully they were cutting down every tree they could find, and it was sometimes hard to stomach, but they made it very pleasant. And then WC Squared would come in, and Joe Foy and Paul George were pretty good, but Adrian Carr would spend 45 minutes telling us that we were stupid and corrupt. At the end of which I'd be thinking, bring back those Mac Blow guys, they must be right. They're just, so there was, as I say, a rambunctious and inexpert period. Those of you who know remember the name Ben Parfit will remember that there were people on the case at the time who were doing great work, and the advent of things like an AstroTurf group like the Forest Alliance. That was, the BC Forest Alliance arose at a time when I didn't know what astroturfing was. Astroturfing arose in the sort of, formally in the early 1990s, people in the States especially started to understand that grassroots organizations had more sway in political circles than lobbyists. They were gaining more sway, particularly in the States. So the best PR firms and the richest companies started to say, well, if grassroots groups are the way to go, let's buy ourselves one. And they started setting them up. The first application I knew was the BC Forest Alliance. The most recent is the Tea Party. When the BC Forest Alliance got set up, yes, they had Jack Monroe and they had Patrick Moore. So when those guys came into the office, they didn't get to the office until Stephen Hume had already done the piece telling us that Burson Marsteller, the big international PR firm, had paid for this whole organization. So they get into the office, and you've got Pat Moore and Jack Monroe on one side of the table, and you've got Terry Glavin and the brothers Hume on the other side of the table, and you have never heard the F-bomb drop as many times. I had never heard it spoken in the editorial, in the boardroom at the Vancouver Sun until that meeting, and that was the closest to actual physical violence that of any meeting I ever saw in the place. So regardless that we were, and I will acknowledge this, doing a really bad job of covering many of those, much of what was happening in the day, we were doing a better job than we are today. Than Pac Press, I would argue, than Pac Press is today. And part of the reason is because you had some feisty, fiery, very passionate people in the building, and you had like twice as many reporters as you have in there today. The number of journalists practicing the art in town today is you could have a sword fight in the Vancouver Sun newsroom at noon and not endanger anybody. The place is just decimated. So that's had there's been a huge impact in the last 20 years. All by way of a long aside and a defensive one, I suppose. On the whole greenwashing thing, greenwashing arises in lots of different ways, and it arises, I think, sometimes relatively innocently. There are people in business who actually, people who are selling products that are actually green, people who think that if they can reduce the amount of plastic in their water bottle, that's green. And they get caught up, because they're in business and they're trying to make money, they get caught up with those messages. That's the sort of, it's not benign, but it's the more benign end of the continuum. The more corrupt end of the continuum, as we've witnessed in the climate change conversation, is when people just decide to go right out and lie. And they're not just going to lie, they're going to lie with incredible professionalism and determination. They're going to set out whole campaigns of lying. They're going to, as they have in the last 20 years, spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on specific strategies to just tell us that a problem is not a problem. And I say this knowing that I'm a wacko conspiracy theorist. Conspiracy theories are highly unpopular in mainstream media, and anytime you actually believe something, you are immediately dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. The bizarre thing I find about conspiracy theories is that conspiracy theories are always imagined to be peculiar to government and the left, and to journalism too, in a way. Whenever anyone talked about media conspiracies, when I was still in daily media, I always said, if you ever have to choose between conspiracy and incompetence, when you're seeing something happening in the press, always assume incompetence, and you'll never be wrong. I then moved on to a short, sharp municipal political career, during which I found that this rule is also very apt for government. If you think the government's conspiring to do something, not usually they're blundering into it. Almost nothing that government does that's bad happens on purpose. It's always inadvertent. But when you look back on what's happened in the climate change conversation for the last 20 years, it has been highly conspiratorial, highly expert, and very pointed. The book that Shane so generously waved at you is proof that I can go on about this for 70,000 words. But specifically, the three most compelling pieces of information that I would offer quickly are three strategy papers that were produced in the 1990s. The first one was by the Western Fuels Association, which is the conglomerate of coal-fired power plant producers, coal companies, and railway companies that serve those coal-fired power plants. Western Fuels Association created something called the Information Council on the Environment in 1991, and the whole thrust of their campaign was to get people to think that climate change either wasn't happening or might be a good thing. And they went out and they hired PR firms and they focus group messages, and then they advertised those messages in the newspaper. And the messages were things like, some people say the Earth is warming. Some people also said the Earth was flat. My favorite was some people, if the Earth is warming, if the Earth is getting warmer, why is Tennessee getting colder? And there's this lovely image of a donkey with a muffler, a scarf around his neck. And it's my favorite of those images because at the time that advertisement ran, Kentucky was not getting colder. They ran it on a cold day, but Kentucky was, as the whole of the central US is, been getting warmer at faster than the global national average. But they weren't testing. The PR guys who came up with this stuff were not testing for accuracy, they were testing for efficacy. They were trying to find messages that would touch people emotionally, that would make people go, yeah, it's bloody cold out here today, and what are those guys talking about? So the Western Fuels Association did this whole campaign. Their strategy paper ultimately got leaked, and therefore they had to back it off. Right on their heels, a group called the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition emerged in the States. This was a group paid for by Philip Morris, where Philip Morris went to APCO Worldwide, another big PR firm, and said, help. you know, people are quitting smoking, the government's on to us, what are we going to do? And APCO came back and said, you know, you guys have no credibility whatsoever. You have completely, you know, been caught lying so many times that no one will believe you. Your scientists have been caught prevaricating in so many interesting ways, no one will believe them. So you can just forget it. But perhaps if you can organize a grassroots organization, an AstroTurf group, of independent scientists, and those scientists talk about the frailties, the uncertainties, the weakness of science overall, maybe you can leverage that to doubt about secondhand smoke and about the health of smoking itself. So Philip Morris said, hey, this is great, and APCO, Advancement of Sound Science Coalition task, sent out 20,000 letters to business leaders and corporations all over the United States, and then ultimately to Europe, an additional amount to Europe as well, looking for people who would join them in this campaign, because they realized that if the task was only going to be a tobacco organization, people would get onto it quite quickly. And the people who they asked to join them were, you know, Monsanto, Exxon, all those guys, the big fossil fuel industry producers, the big automakers, anybody who was in genetically modified foods. Monsanto was an early contributor. They got caught, and their stuff came out in the tobacco lawsuits in the mid-90s. Right after that, the American Petroleum Institute came along. And they hired the executive director of TASC, a guy named Steve Malloy. You can find him under Junkman if you Google. And they came up, they sort of refined this whole thing. Some of this stuff had been done already before, but they said, you know, what we need to do, we need to go out and hire scientists. We need to media train them, the scientists who will say what we want them to say. We need to media train them so they'll say it well. We need to write a whole bunch of opinion page pieces so that every time a reporter anywhere in any newspaper writes a story saying climate change is a problem, we can show up the next day with a story saying, your scientist says it's a problem, but our scientist says it's not. And you're honor bound by the journalistic code of impartiality to run this story, which we just happen to have ready for you to go. They also, one of the, I think, most evil things that they said was, don't go to big markets. Don't go to major markets where they have environment reporters and science reporters, because it's just a nuisance. Go to middle-sized markets where you're dealing with general assignment reporters and junior guys and women who have no expertise. Because if a PhD shows up there and says, I'm a scientist, and you have to listen to me, then the 24-year-old reporter who's never dealt with a scientist or read anything on climate change before is going to go, ooh. And therefore, you had a very specific campaign, smart, I mean, in a greasy way, but extraordinarily well coordinated, extraordinarily well funded. And obviously, by what's happening today, extraordinarily successful. In 2006, 79% of Americans, according to the Pew Center for Research, 79% of Americans thought that climate change was happening. In 2010, as of about a month ago, that number is 59%. During a period when every measure has been making it more obvious that we're in deep trouble, fewer Americans believe it, and the number of people who think that humans are responsible has dropped from 50% to 34%, I believe. So the campaign has been just incredibly effective, and you know, if there are people who want to argue with me about the science today, I urge you not to. I urge you to go away and read Andrew Weaver's Keeping Our Cool, or pick up the reports of any major scientific organization in the world. And I include the Royal Society, the American Academies of Science, the Royal Society of the UK, any of the academies of science of any developed nation in the world. Read that and argue with those guys, because they're the best. You know, 97% of the scientists in the world say we're setting fire to the place and it's a bad idea. So when people who I can prove are either not expert, this is the B-Smog blood test. If somebody says climate change isn't happening, we ask 3 questions. Are they an expert? Are they currently doing science? Are they writing in peer-reviewed journals and actually doing research? And are they taking money from big oil, from are they self-interested in some way, either directly or indirectly? And basically, we've been doing this work for 6 years, and we haven't found anybody who can cleanly pass the test. And the evidence of that is that, having written that very statement in the book Climate Cover-Up, we haven't had so much as a passing letter from a lawyer, because we can prove it. And none of the people who, and the people who are in the business of climate change denial, guys like Dr. S. Fred Singer, who's been in the denial business for not 100 years, because he's only 80. But Fred Singer denied that acid rain had anything to do with coal-fired power plants. He denies still that asbestos is bad for you. He denied that secondhand smoke is a problem at all during the time that he was working for the Tobacco Institute. He denied that chlorofluorocarbons cause the ozone hole. I mean, this guy would deny that it's Saturday if someone paid him to do it. And he still is getting quoted in mainstream newspapers as an expert. So here we come to my one of my many complaints. This has been, in my lifetime, the greatest media failure I have ever witnessed. And this is my community. I mean, I sometimes say that I'm a recovering journalist, because I make a lot of money doing, or more of my income doing other stuff. But I was in the newspaper, I was in the daily newspaper business for 20 years, and I've been doing magazine journalism and whatnot since, and the Wiesmann blog. It's been just a colossal failure, and it's been a failure for lots of reasons. One of which, the consolidation of media, the bias of media. I mean, I was editing the editorial page just at the time that Conrad Black was consolidating his ownership of what was then Southern. And I was doing the Bill Good show, and they were shrieking about how we were the Bay Street Sun, that we were under the influence of these Toronto accountants. I'll tell you what, the Toronto accountants, and before Conrad Black, they didn't even know what the newspaper was, and they didn't care. They thought it was a widget. Conrad Black got there, he knew what a newspaper was. But Bill Good, a caller called in and said, you guys, you just do whatever you're told. And I said, not true. I've been writing editorials for 5 years. On no single occasion have I been told what we're going to write. And then, it's about a week later, somebody came to the office, somebody who was at the time the editor-in-chief, and said, on this particular issue, whatever editorial you plan to write is going to say this, or you're not going to write an editorial. And then you go through the period of Conrad Black, which Conrad Black he was at least a little bit subtle about it. He just replaced all the editors-in-chief and made sure that the editorial boards all hired alumni from the Fraser Institute, which is quite true. And then the Aspers came along, and the Aspers started producing editorials that centrally, and telling every newspaper in the chain that they had has been huge. But there's been a real frontline effect as well that I find still very distressing. And lots has been written about this, the whole idea of journalistic balance, of impartiality, the idea that you should always be able to quote one person on one side of a story and one person on the other side. And of course, the people I've been talking about have taken great advantage of this. But Naomi Oreskes is a woman, a science historian from University of California at San Diego, in about 2004, did a review of all of the peer-reviewed science that had been written about climate change in the previous 10 years that had global climate change in the abstract, the words global climate change in the abstract. She found 928 papers, and of those 928 papers, she found this many that took legitimate peer-reviewed journals. During the same period, a couple of guys named Boykoff and Boykoff, Max and Jules, academic brothers, again from the States, looked at what they called the prestige press, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. They found 663 stories, 653, lots, that mention climate change. And in those stories, in 53% of those stories, they had quoted one scientist, one person saying that it was happening and it concerned, and one person, an expert on the other side, saying that it was not. So science journals, 928 to 0, mainstream media, 53%, and a further 9% only quoted guys on the other side, only quoted people saying that it wasn't happening. So even today, you have reporters who are overworked, who don't get to do the kind of research, who don't have the educational background. Tell you what, there are not very many science majors, none I know of, in any newsroom in the country. There's only 2 actual science reporters currently working at mainstream newspapers today. I get that from the Science Media Centre of Canada. So the expertise is not there. The passion is not particularly there. The people who are working there don't have the time or the encouragement to go out and do the research. So the knee-jerk to say, let's just get a guy on the other side to make sure that we're covered, remains. But I just will no longer buy it. This is, I would argue, the most important issue facing humankind today. We are quite, I mean, there's a 95% chance that we're setting fire to the planet in a way that is going to do, I think, real damage in our lifetime and considerable damage in the lifetime of our kids. If somebody told you there was a 90+% chance that the airplane you were about to get on was going to crash, you would not get on. And in terms of risk management, if you want to buy a house, the bank will not give you a mortgage unless you get fire insurance for the 0.06% chance that your house will burn down. So in terms of, we understand risk analysis sometimes, but because climate change is only certain to a 90-odd% reliability rate, we're saying, hey, it's not something that we have to worry about. This is not acceptable. So yes, mainstream media is doing a bad job. I don't think that we in the, I'm pointing at Emma. Emma also works at, is doing Jim Hogan's next book, Emma Pullman, and also does some work at the Bismarck blog. You know, we in alternative media are not doing a good enough job, clearly. But I think every person who works in mainstream media has got a responsibility to understand the science well enough to be able to say, that guy is full of shit. And I'm not going to put what he says in my newspaper. And until people in the media take that responsibility and take it seriously, we are going to remain an uneducated citizenry, and as such, we are going to get an increase.